Scott Adkins looked down at Keanu Reeves sitting in the stands and smiled. "Last 30 seconds against me," he said, "and I'll call you my teacher." 7 seconds later, Scott was on the floor. He never saw it coming. Portland in October doesn't ease you in. The rain just arrives, fine, gray, persistent, and the city accepts it the way it accepts most things, without comment. By 8 that Saturday morning, the streets around the Hargrove Center were already dark and wet, the maple trees along the avenue dropping their leaves in slow, indifferent clusters. The kind of morning that doesn't ask for your opinion and doesn't wait for you to adjust. The Hargrove Center itself was a converted warehouse on the east side of the city. Concrete facade, tall, narrow windows, a plain marquee above the entrance. Northwest Combat Invitational Annual Open. No declaración. No promises. The building knew its audience well enough to know that neither was required. Inside, close to 600 people had taken their seats by 9. Not a casual crowd. No one had wandered in off the street looking for something to fill a Saturday. These were practitioners, coaches, competitors, people who had organized significant portions of their lives around the serious study of martial arts. They didn't need introductions to understand each other. They shared a language that lived below conversation, in the quality of how they watched, how they sat, how they held themselves still in a space full of movement. When someone in that room made a technical error, you could feel the collective recognition without anyone saying a word. When someone did something right, genuinely, cleanly right, the room registered it the same way. The junior divisions were already underway when the doors opened again near the back of the hall. The man who came through them wore a gray hoodie, dark jeans, and a baseball cap pulled low. He carried nothing. No bag, no assistant, nobody beside him. He was 54 years old, and he moved through the entrance the way people move when they have no interest in being looked at. Unhurried, economical, taking up exactly the space he needed and no more. He didn't pause at the entrance to get his bearings. He already knew where he was going. He found a seat in the 4th row, left center section. Sat down. Went still. Not the stillness of someone holding themselves back. The stillness of someone who had arrived where they intended to be and was completely there. He didn't check his phone. Didn't scan the room for familiar faces. His eyes went to the competition floor and stayed there, reading what was happening with the patient focus of someone who understood that watching carefully was itself a form of work. A few people nearby glanced over, held the look a beat longer than usual. One or two said something quietly to the person beside them. But the floor had their attention too, and a man in a gray hoodie sitting quietly in the 4th row, however familiar his face, didn't generate the kind of pull that demands a response. He wasn't performing anything. He was just watching. In a room that valued that quality above most others, he passed without disruption. What the room didn't know, and what wasn't visible from the outside, was the nature of the years behind that stillness. Keanu Reeves had spent a long time preparing for the John Wick films, longer and more seriously than most people understood. Not learning choreography, learning the actual disciplines. Judo, Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu, real work with instructors who had no interest in his filmography and no professional reason to soften their feedback when something didn't work. He had trained with partners who applied genuine resistance, people who pushed back honestly, who didn't adjust their intensity based on who they were standing across from. He had done it because he decided at some point that if he was going to portray a man who moved through the world a certain way, he needed to understand what that movement actually cost. Not what it looked like, what it required. From the body, from the mind, from the accumulated hours that nobody sees. He had never talked about it much publicly. It was the kind of work that doesn't need an audience to be real. And Keanu Reeves had always seemed to understand, better than most people in his position, the difference between the work and the talking about the work. He was in Portland that Saturday for the same reason he had done any of it, because a room full of 600 serious people doing hard things honestly was exactly the kind of room worth sitting inside and watching carefully. He was there to observe, to learn something, to add to the understanding he'd been building for years, one honest session at a time. That was all. That was enough. On the floor below, the intermediate brackets were beginning. the level of skill rising with each successive division, the crowd's energy building the slow, collective way that tournament energy builds, not in bursts but steadily, like water coming to temperature over a long morning. Coaches at the edges of the floor called adjustments to their competitors. Judges made their notes. The machinery of a well-run event moved forward with its organized rhythm, each division completing and opening the way for the next. Keanu sat in the fourth row and watched it all, reading the weight distribution in each stance, clocking the moments where commitment became irreversible, storing what he saw the way he'd been storing things for years, not as entertainment but as information. Outside, the Portland rain kept falling, indifferent to everything happening inside the building it was falling past. It was just past 10:30 when Scott Adkins came through the side entrance. He was 42 years old, 5 feet 11, and built from more than 30 years of deliberate physical work, Kyokushin karate and taekwondo from childhood in England, black belts in both, serious cross-training layered on top over the years. He wore a white training uniform with a black belt, and he moved through the side corridor with the ease of someone who had walked into rooms like this one many times and never once found them unwelcoming. 3 training partners followed behind him, all in white, capable men. But the arrangement of the group made clear, without anyone organizing it, who its center was. Something needs to be said here plainly. Scott Adkins was the real thing. He had competed. He had sparred with people who had no reason to make it easy for him. The confidence he brought into the Hargrove Center that morning wasn't performance. It was the earned confidence of someone who had tested himself in real conditions over many years and found the results consistently satisfactory. That kind of confidence has a different weight than the ordinary kind. It doesn't announce itself. It doesn't need to. The people in that building, who knew what genuine training looked like, recognized it the moment he walked in, not because of how he held himself, but because of what was underneath how he held himself. The difference is real, and practitioners feel it. The room noticed him the way rooms notice people who carry that quality. Not all at once, but in a ripple, section by section, orienting slightly toward the new presence without being entirely able to account for why. Before his exhibition began, Scott stood near the edge of the competition floor with a loose group of coaches who had come down from the stands to greet him. The conversation was easy at first, the familiar shorthand of people who share a world, who recognize each other through a common vocabulary of training and competition and the accumulated knowledge of bodies pushed honestly over time. But somewhere in the conversation, the register shifted. His voice didn't rise. It didn't need to. It carried the way voices carry when the speaker isn't concerned about who hears. He was talking about the difference, he said, between people who had actually earned their understanding of fighting, through years of cold gyms, real opponents, and consequences that couldn't be edited out afterward, and people who had simply purchased the appearance of it. People with enough money to hire the best coaches available. Enough industry infrastructure to control every variable, adjust every angle, repeat every sequence until it looked exactly right for a camera. Enough resources to construct something that looked, from the outside, remarkably like the real thing, without ever having stood in front of someone who had no professional obligation to make things easier for them. He said it as a statement of fact, not a grievance. Flat and plain, which made it land considerably harder than a grievance would have. No names. He didn't need them. A few coaches nodded slowly. A few said nothing. One glanced briefly toward the fourth row, then looked away without a word. The exhibition began at 10:45. Scott Adkins and his 3 partners moved onto the floor, and the Hargrove Center gave them its full attention. What followed was genuinely impressive, and that needs to be said clearly, because nothing that happens later changes what came before it. The Kyokushin sequences were fast and clean and carried real force. Not the kind you have to imagine, but the kind visible in the way the air moves and the way bodies respond when technique lands with actual weight behind it. His kicks weren't decorative. The height was real. The speed was real. And underneath both, the accumulated power of years of correct repetition was present in every movement, in the way that things are present when they've been built slowly and honestly rather than assembled quickly for an occasion. His partners received the techniques with real timing and real commitment, not performing falls but actually landing them, rolling and recovering with the smooth efficiency of people who had spent years learning how to hit the floor safely. That honesty made the demonstration more convincing, not less. At one point, Scott threw a jumping roundhouse at a height that drew an involuntary sound from the stands. Not quite a cheer, more like the sharp collective exhale of 600 people watching something exceed what they'd prepared themselves for. Several people leaned forward in their seats. A coach near the south wall crossed his arms and nodded once, slowly, in the way of someone who has seen a great deal and has decided something is genuinely worth acknowledging. Scott's expression during all of it was uncomplicated. He was doing something he was very good at, and he knew it. There was no performance in that recognition. Just a clean, direct engagement with the work, the expression of someone who has put in the hours and is now drawing on them without needing to think about the drawing. In the fourth row, Keanu Reeves watched with the same expression he'd had since he sat down. Calm, completely still, not watching a performance, reading one. The mechanics underneath each technique. The moments between initiation and completion where a body's commitment becomes irreversible and the window for response narrows to almost nothing. He was reading Scott Adkins the way he'd read every competitor that morning. Carefully, without judgment, storing it. When the exhibition ended, the applause was genuine and sustained. Scott and his partners bowed to the floor and the crowd. Several coaches stood from their seats along the edge of the competition area to offer their acknowledgement. It was a strong performance. The room said so in the clearest way rooms have of saying things. Scott was near the south edge of the floor, receiving congratulations from several coaches who'd approached, when one of his training partners, a lean, focused man in his late 30s named Callum, leaned in close and said something quietly near his ear. Scott's expression shifted, almost imperceptibly, but it shifted. He turned and looked toward the stands. His eyes moved to the fourth row, left center section. The man in the gray hoodie and the baseball cap, sitting exactly where he'd been sitting since the morning started, watching the next group of competitors warm up on the far side of the floor as though the past 20 minutes hadn't required his attention at all. Scott looked at him for a long moment. Then he said something to Callum that Callum received with a small nod, and he began walking toward the stands. He covered the distance with the same loose, unhurried stride he used everywhere, the stride of someone who expects the path ahead to be clear and has generally found that it is. The people in his way shifted without being asked, the small instinctive accommodation that crowds make for people who move as though they belong at the front of whatever room they've entered. The current of attention in the room moved with him, conversation by conversation, section by section, until the coaches along the south wall had gone quiet and were watching, and the competitors warming up on the far side of the floor had paused mid-movement. Scott stopped at the railing in front of the fourth row. Keanu Reeves looked up. They were, as it happened, nearly the same height, both around 5 feet 11. But Scott was standing at a railing in a white training uniform with a black belt, and Keanu was sitting in a folding chair in a gray hoodie and a baseball cap. The physical arrangement of the moment carried a message that didn't require translation, and Scott was aware of it. He looked at Keanu with the expression of someone recognizing another person and deciding how to frame what comes next. Then he smiled, a recognizing smile, warm enough on the surface, but carrying something underneath that wasn't quite warmth, something adjacent to it. The difference between those two things was small and precise, and it was exactly the kind of small, precise difference that tends to matter most. Keanu Reeves, he said. John Wick. Great character. He said character the way that places a person on one side of a screen and leaves them there. The word did the work it was intended to do, cleanly and without elaboration. The people in the adjacent seats stopped pretending to watch the warm-up on the far side of the floor. Scott continued at the same easy volume, no effort to limit his audience, no lowering of the voice that would have suggested he had any reason to lower it. He said that what Keanu had accomplished in those films was the product of extraordinary resources. The best coaches money could hire, controlled environments, the ability to repeat every sequence until it looked exactly right, and a production infrastructure designed to present the results in the most favorable light available. That kind of preparation had value, he said. He wasn't dismissing it. But it wasn't the same as standing in front of someone who had no professional reason to make things easier for you, in conditions where nothing could be adjusted after the fact. He said it without aggression, measured, reasonable, which, in its way, made it considerably harder to set aside than aggression would have been. A few people nearby exchanged glances. The coach from the south wall who'd nodded during the exhibition had drifted closer to the railing, and was now watching without expression. Keanu looked at Scott through all of it. Didn't look away. Didn't rearrange his expression or shift in his seat. He waited until Scott had finished, genuinely waited, giving the full space of what was being said without preparing his response while it was still being said. Then he said, evenly and without decoration, that the Kyokushin demonstration had been very good. That was it. No edge in it. No defense. Just what he actually thought, delivered the way he delivered everything, without excess and without performance, as a plain statement of fact. Scott received it the way people receive compliments they were already certain of, as confirmation rather than new information. He nodded once, and then he said it. If you can last 30 seconds against me, I'll call you my teacher. A slight smile with it. The relaxed smile of someone extending an offer they're certain will be declined. Framed as generosity, because generosity costs nothing when you're sure the other party can't take you up on it. He was looking down at a man sitting in a folding chair in a gray hoodie. A spectator, a film actor, someone whose world and his own had never meaningfully intersected before this morning. The arrangement of the moment had placed itself entirely in his favor, and he knew it, and the smile knew it too. The Hargrove Center went quiet. Garrett Holloway, silver-haired, mid-50s, more than 2 decades of running martial arts events across the Pacific Northwest, was standing a few feet away at the edge of the floor. He'd been in this world long enough to recognize certain moments before they fully arrived, to feel the shape of what was coming before it completed itself. He didn't move toward them, didn't intervene. He simply stood with full awareness and chose to witness rather than interrupt. Some moments needed to happen. Keanu was still for a moment. Not the stillness of someone searching for a response. The stillness of someone who already had one and was simply finishing a thought before delivering it. He looked at Scott with the same direct, undivided attention he'd been giving the competition floor all morning. Then he unzipped his hoodie, folded it over the back of his chair, and stood up. Not the way people stand when they're preparing for something. The way he rose from any chair, the same economy, the same absence of announcement, no part of the movement wasted on presentation. He was on his feet now, and something in the arrangement of the moment quietly shifted. They were the same height. They were not, in any visible way, the mismatched pair the situation had appeared to present. What Scott had assumed was organized entirely in his favor had rearranged itself, without drama, the moment Keanu stood up and simply looked at him. "Sure," Keanu said. One word. Same even tone he used for everything else. No performance. No provocation. Just his answer, accurate and complete. Scott blinked. Brief and quickly contained, but visible. The single unguarded moment of a man receiving a word he hadn't prepared for. His expression reassembled itself quickly into something steady. He nodded, stepped back from the railing. They moved toward the edge of the floor. The information traveled through the Hargrove Center the way it travels through any room full of people who are already paying close attention. Fast and without needing to be announced. Competitors paused their warm-ups. Coaches turned from their conversations mid-sentence. People rose from their seats at the back of the stands and moved forward, drawn by the current that runs through a crowd when something real is about to happen and everyone present understands, without being told, exactly what kind of something it is. Garrett Holloway folded his hands in front of him and went still. The quality of attention in the room had changed. This was no longer the appreciative, comfortable attention of 600 people watching something scheduled and familiar. This was something tighter. The held-breath attention of people who understood enough about what they were watching to know, honestly, that they didn't know how it ended. That not knowing, in a room full of people who believed they knew most things about this, was itself the most remarkable thing that had happened all morning. Scott took his position at the edge of the floor and turned briefly toward the stands. "Consider this a free lesson," he said, his voice carrying easily across the hall. "Money and fame are useful things, but they don't replace real skill. pleasantly delivered. The tone of a man stating something he genuinely believes and sees no reason to soften for anyone. A few people in the stands laughed quietly. A few didn't. Keanu didn't respond. He stood a few feet away, hands loose at his sides, feet roughly shoulder-width apart. No stance. No guard. No visible preparation of any kind. He simply stood the way he'd been standing since he rose from the fourth row, the same easy stillness he'd carried through the entrance that morning, unchanged by the walk to the floor, unchanged by Scott's remark, unchanged by 600 pairs of eyes now aimed directly at him. That stillness was what people would return to afterward, when they tried to describe what they'd witnessed to people who weren't there. Not the 7 seconds. What happened in the moment before the 7 seconds. Not the stillness of someone suppressing a reaction, or someone who hadn't understood what was said to them. Something else entirely. The stillness of someone who had already arrived at the only place the situation required them to be, and was waiting for the situation to finish catching up. Scott took his stance. Correct Kyokushin. Clean and completely automatic after 30+ years of drilling, weight distributed, hands at the proper height, the body arranged in the geometry that decades of training had made as natural and unthinking as standing upright. The crowd recognized it immediately. There was nothing theatrical in it. It was simply how his body organized itself when it was about to do what it had spent a lifetime learning to do. He opened with a roundhouse kick. The movement his nervous system knew more completely than almost any other. Legs sweeping along a wide curved path, building velocity through hip rotation, concentrating force at the far end of the arc where momentum has had the full curve to accumulate. A Kyokushin roundhouse is built on commitment. The body gives itself to it entirely, and that commitment is the source of its power. It is also, for anyone who has genuinely studied how the geometry works, the location of its one exploitable characteristic. The kick traveled toward Keanu Reeves with real intention, thrown by a real martial artist in excellent condition who had every reason to believe it would land. Keanu didn't move away from it. He moved into it. A single step, left foot forward and slightly inward, closing the distance between them rather than increasing it, entering the inside of the arc at the point where the kick's force hadn't yet built to what it would become at full extension. Small step, precise. To most of the 600 people in that room watching the kick rather than the man receiving it, the movement looked like almost nothing. A slight shift in position. Easy to miss if you didn't know exactly what you were looking for. What it accomplished was this. Every technique carries its force at a particular point in its execution. For a roundhouse, that point lives toward the end of the arc, when the leg is fully extended and the hip rotation has transferred everything it has. Earlier in the arc, inside the curve, close to the body throwing it, the same leg is moving but without the accumulated momentum that makes it dangerous. The inside of a roundhouse is, counterintuitively, one of the safer places to be when one is coming at you. Not through bravery. Through understanding, a precise technical understanding of how force builds and where it lives and where, for just a fraction of a second, it hasn't arrived yet. Keanu had spent years building exactly that understanding, in gyms where it was tested against resistance that had no reason to cooperate. And in the fraction of a second that Scott's kick opened, that understanding became a single step that sent the technique's full force into empty air. Scott felt the contact that should have been there. There was nothing. In the same instant, not after, not as a separate movement, but woven into the same continuous action. Keanu's right hand found Scott's wrist. Not a grab. Placement. Fingers and palm meeting at the precise angle that allows redirection without announcing itself as a hold before it has finished its work. His left hand moved to Scott's lead shoulder, positioned at the point that years of honest repetition had made automatic. Together, these 2 points of contact accomplished what judo calls kazushi, the removal of a person's balance before they realize their balance has been removed. Not force meeting force. Geometry, applied at the right moment, in the right place, with a degree of precision that leaves the other person's body no coherent direction to resist. Scott felt the floor become uncertain beneath him. Not pain. Not impact. Something more disorienting than either. The sensation of a body that had maintained reliable balance for 42 years discovering, without warning, that the balance was simply no longer where it had always been. Redirected, without his participation, along a path he hadn't chosen and couldn't locate quickly enough to resist. He understood what was happening before his mind could form a response to the understanding, the way experienced grapplers understand things, through the body directly, faster than conscious thought can travel. Keanu brought him down. Not explosive. A controlled descent, the body's own momentum received and guided to its natural conclusion without additional force applied against it. The way judo works when the initial break of balance has been executed cleanly. Scott arrived on the hardwood floor of the Hargrove Center with the sound of a technique completed correctly. He was not hurt, not unconscious, but he was down, his wrist held at the angle that communicated, without ambiguity, what the available options were if he considered rising without permission. He recognized that angle from the inside, the way any serious grappler recognizes it, through physical information rather than thought. He didn't attempt to test it. That restraint, too, was a form of knowledge. Knowing the difference between what you could attempt and what it would actually cost you to attempt it. Keanu held the position for 1 additional second. Then he released, straightened, stepped back. He stood exactly where he'd been standing before the technique began. Hands returned to his sides. Expression unchanged. The same calm, direct attention he'd carried through the entrance of the Hargrove Center that morning, through the junior divisions, through Scott's exhibition, through the conversation at the railing. Nothing had been added to it. Nothing had been removed. The Hargrove Center didn't make a sound for 5 full seconds. 600 people who had given significant portions of their lives to martial arts, who had seen knockouts and submissions and throws and every variety of technique that serious training produces, were completely silent. Not because they hadn't understood what they'd witnessed, because they had. Because what had arrived and completed itself in a duration their minds were still measuring had been executed with a precision and economy that left no room for the ordinary responses. Just silence. 5 full seconds of it. The kind that only settles over a room when 600 people have seen something they weren't ready for and haven't yet worked out what to do with what they saw. Scott Adkins lay on the floor and didn't move. Not because he couldn't. He was physically fine, no injury, no pain that required attending to. He lay still because something had happened that his body had absorbed before his mind could catch up, and the catching up was taking a moment he found he couldn't rush through. The hardwood beneath him was cool and solid, and he was, without quite intending to be, grateful for those qualities. He was aware of the 600 people above him in the stands. He was aware of the slow return of noise to the room, the murmur beginning to spread through the crowd like a tide coming back after having pulled out completely. He was aware that Callum was somewhere at the edge of his vision. He held on to none of those awarenesses. He stayed where he was and let the moment be what it was. Callum took a step toward him. Scott raised one hand, not sharply, just raised it, and Callum stopped. The gesture said what needed to be said without requiring a word. This was not a moment that needed company. Whatever was being sorted through on that floor was being sorted through by one person, and that was the only way it could be done. He pushed himself to sitting, placed his hands on his knees, looked at the floor directly in front of him. The square of hardwood that had received him 7 seconds after he'd issued a challenge, he'd been completely certain was safe to issue. He sat there and looked at it the way people look at things that have just told them something they weren't prepared to hear, and that cannot be unheard. 42 years old. More than 30 years of serious training. Black belts. Real competition. A body he had built methodically, honestly, through work that nobody had handed him. All of that was still true. All of that was still real. And none of it had been enough to locate the floor before the floor located him. He sat with that, not fighting it, not framing it, not yet reaching for whatever would come next. Just sitting with it on a square of hardwood in Portland on a Saturday morning, in the quiet that follows something you didn't see coming. Around him, the Hargrove Center continued its slow reassembly of normal noise, conversation returning section by section, the sound of 600 people beginning the work of describing to each other what they'd just seen. But Scott wasn't in the room yet. He was still on the floor, still somewhere in those 7 seconds. He got to his feet. Slowly, not from any injury, but from the deliberate pace of someone who understood that standing up too quickly would be a kind of dishonesty. A performance of composure the situation hadn't yet earned. He straightened. He looked at Keanu Reeves, who was standing exactly where he'd been standing since the technique completed. Hands at his sides, expression unchanged, waiting for nothing. Scott's face carried something it hadn't carried when he walked through the side entrance that morning. The open, uncomplicated confidence, the expression of someone for whom most situations resolved into settled questions before they'd fully developed, was still there. But it had company now. Something that lived alongside it and altered its character without replacing it. The expression of someone who has just found, in the most direct and unambiguous classroom available, that the map they've been navigating with is accurate as far as it reaches, and doesn't reach as far as they'd assumed. He didn't complete the bargain. He asked a question instead. A real one, in the tone of someone who genuinely wanted the answer. How long did it take you to get there? Keanu looked at him for a moment, then answered without hesitation and without decoration. Every day, he said. And I'm still learning. 8 words. And what made them land the way they landed wasn't the content. It was the complete absence of performance in them. No modesty shaped for an audience. No humility as a form of display. Just a 54-year-old man offering a plain description of his actual situation. Someone who had trained seriously and consistently, who had sat in the 4th row of a martial arts tournament on a rainy Saturday morning in Portland not to be recognized but to observe something worth observing, and who was, genuinely and without drama, still in the middle of the process he'd been in for decades. No destination reached. No era evil. Just the ongoing work, continuing. Scott stood with that for a moment. Long enough for something to settle. He had walked into the Hargrove Center that morning with a question already answered, who was more skilled, where the lines were, what the hierarchy looked like. The floor had handed him a different question entirely. Not who was better. What he still had left to learn. Those aren't the same question, and they don't tend to produce the same kind of person, depending on which one you spend your career actually asking. Keanu gave a small nod. Then he walked back to the 4th row, picked up his hoodie from the back of the chair where he'd left it, pulled it on, settled his cap, and headed toward the main exit with the same unhurried steps he'd used coming in that morning. No acknowledgement of what had just occurred. No pause for the room's response. But the room responded anyway. As he moved through the stands, the 600 people of the Hargrove Center parted around him. Not because anyone organized it, not because anyone asked. Crowds do this sometimes, after certain moments, when the person moving through them is responsible for what just happened and everyone present understands that without needing to discuss it. Path opened. Natural, undiscussed, immediate. Keanu Reeves walked through it and out the main doors and was gone. And the wet Portland morning received him back without ceremony, without fanfare, without pausing for anything that had happened inside the building it was falling past. Scott stood in the middle of the floor for a long moment after the doors had closed. Callum and the other 2 partners approached. Nobody spoke. There was a version of this moment where one of them might have offered something. An explanation, a mitigating angle, some interpretive frame to stand inside while the dust settled and the room stopped looking. Scott didn't invite that version. He stood in the silence he was still carrying, and his partners, who knew him well enough to read his silences accurately, stood with him without filling it. Then he did something that none of them expected. He walked to the south wall, picked up a folding chair from the stack against it, carried it across the floor to the left center section of the 4th row, the section, the position that Keanu Reeves had occupied from the moment he arrived that morning until the moment he left. He set the chair down. He sat in it. He looked at the competition floor. The afternoon divisions were resuming, the tournament moving forward with the patient, unsentimental efficiency of something that doesn't pause for the education of individuals, however significant that education might be. Competitors were taking their positions. Judges were consulting their materials. The machinery of the event continued as it had always been going to continue, indifferent to what had happened at the edge of the floor an hour earlier. Scott didn't speak to Callum, didn't reach for his phone, didn't explain himself to anyone. He watched, with the kind of attention that you can only genuinely bring to something after you've been reminded, concretely and without possibility of misunderstanding, how much you still don't understand. Complete. Undivided. The same quality of attention that had occupied that row since 9 o'clock that morning. Reading everything the floor had to offer, storing it, building something from it that no single session could account for. He was still there when the afternoon divisions ended, 4 hours later. Still in the 4th row when the industrial lights dimmed and the last of the practitioners filed out into the wet Portland evening, their conversations fading down the avenue, the tournament dissolving back into the ordinary Saturday it had interrupted. There's something worth saying, as someone who has spent time with this story. The most significant thing that happened at the Hargrove Center that Saturday wasn't the 7 seconds. It was Scott Adkins carrying a folding chair to the 4th row and sitting in it, quietly, without explanation, without an audience for the gesture, in the seat that had just taught him something he hadn't been looking for when he walked through the side entrance that morning. Most people, when a public moment revises the version of themselves they walked in with, find the exit. They find the explanation. They find the company of people who were on their side before and will remain on their side after, and they accept that comfort without examining what it costs them. Scott found a chair. He sat down in the place where the lesson had come from and watched for 4 hours. That's not nothing. That's actually quite a lot. And Keanu Reeves. What stays with me isn't what he did on the floor. It's those 8 words. Every day. And I'm still learning. At 54, with everything he'd built and demonstrated, that was his honest answer. Not performed, not shaped for the moment, not